Welcome, Professor David Kinley,
Thank you very
Chair
much.
of Human Rights in University of Sydney Law School. So, I've read in your book that you have over 40 years of experience in the field of human rights. So, can you throw some insights on your experiences, personal experiences, even your childhood days that you have mentioned in the book, the Liberty Paradox, like how it framed your ideas of human rights?
Yes, you're right. 40 years of professional human rights, but really, I think all of us who work in human rights have a personal story, and it usually relates to your own characteristics, your own experiences as a child through adolescence and into adulthood. So, in many ways, I would say that my human rights experiences have been from a very young age, even if I didn't realize that they were human rights.
Yeah.
And you're right, in the book I do talk about the fact that I was brought up in Belfast in Northern Ireland, which at that time, in the 70s, in the 60s and 70s, was a violent place, and big constitutional, religious and human rights questions were being asked all the time. So I suppose my education in human rights started then, even if I didn't realize it.
Yeah.
But yes, professionally, maybe 40 years I've been focusing on human rights related issues.
So, how did it frame the idea of book? Like, it's basically, I found it's storytelling, right, and connecting it to the idea of human rights. So, how important is storytelling in writing a book, or maybe taking classes or sessions in Himalayan Field School?
That's a really good question, Amritha, and I think over those 40 years, I've realized increasingly how important storytelling is. And when we say storytelling, you tend to think that that's, just having a chat over dinner or over a cup of tea.
Yeah.
And it doesn't really matter. But in fact, our lives are built around storytelling every day in everything we do. And that's true of education, even profound education. And I think one of the reasons for that is because we all relate to them. So when you are writing in a book or teaching a class and you illustrate an issue, maybe a very deep, profound, important issue with a story that people can relate to, they will immediately grasp the significance. And I think that storytelling is something that is perhaps neglected when we're teachers and lecturers.
So the book also has many stories, right? Like having tea with a dictator. I read
That's
that.
right, you remember. Yeah, indeed.
And there are various stories about death, about love, a lot of expressions that you've brought in which are related to day-to-day freedoms,
Yes.
right? And which story would you say was the most inspiring for you, or which you loved writing in the book?
That is an interesting question. I've got to say, I find it impossible to answer because when I started thinking about this book, I was thinking about how freedom today has become a mantra for many people to demand whatever they want, whenever they want it, and however they want it, without a regard as to how others might be affected by that demand. And we all know, working in human rights and in the law, that freedom must come with responsibilities. And the reason it must come with responsibilities is because your freedom and my freedom may clash, our desires, our demands. And so as soon as they clash, we've got to work out a decision as to whose preference whose demand gets preference. So really the book was about the fact that inclination amongst many people in the West, and maybe you think the same in developing countries, had to be quelled. One had to be, as it were, reminded that one has responsibilities alongside one's freedoms. And what's more, those responsibilities aren't just an anchor or a drag on your freedoms. They are actually necessary for everyone's freedoms, including yours and mine, to exist. without the responsibilities, we would just have a savage fight amongst the fittest. The fittest would win. So really looking at that, I thought, well, what have I learnt in my personal but also my professional life that might demonstrate, illustrate, explain what those responsibilities might mean in a modern sense. And so I thought, well, what are all the things that occupy our daily lives? What are the big ticket items that are always there in nearly every day that we are on this earth? And so I really took them in that form. So as you say, it's got a chapter on wealth and health and security and voice and love and death. So that's the way I decided I would break it up and look at each one of those with little stories in each one of them, drawn from myself, personally or professionally, or from others. And so it became I really enjoyed writing it. I mean, it's by no means comprehensive and it's by no means perfect, but what it did do was allow me to say what I thought were important messages and important stories about each one of those aspects of, I suppose, of my life, because it's largely through my eyes, but through the eyes of some other scholars and other writers and other people in the book, and hopefully get a serious message across. So I wrote it in a way that I hoped people would be attracted to it because of the stories, and then allow the lessons, whether they are profound or not, allow those lessons to come through behind the stories, as it were.
Like, since we are emphasizing a lot on decolonization of law and human rights and all those aspects, so I remember reading Upendra Bakshi in this stance, like he connects Eastern philosophy, wherein the responsibilities are given more importance over the rights. So do you think like we are trying to integrate the Western and Eastern perspectives in this?
That's an excellent question. I mean, Bakshi is actually pointing to a feature that I think is common to all of us, that responsibilities and freedom coexist, but emphasizing the fact that in many cultures, mostly in the developing countries, but not entirely, do emphasize that need to respect your fellow citizens in a way that stresses responsibilities at least to the level of freedoms, or maybe even above them. And in the West, perhaps maybe since the Enlightenment, maybe since the Second World War, with the advent of the Universal Declaration and all the international human rights treaties, largely driven by Western ideals, the idea of freedom has been given a higher place than responsibilities. But in any case, the two things exist in all cultures to varying degrees. So I think it's a question of ebbing and flowing. I think that throughout the histories of every culture, and now those cultures being integrated because of an inevitably globalized world, you're seeing how some emphasize the responsibilities and other the freedoms. So we learn from each other. And I must say I was not drawing on a specific decolonization or an Eastern philosophical standpoint, largely because that's not where I come from, and it would be rather presumptuous of me to do so. It was more what I feel are the necessary ingredients to a life of liberty, because the purpose of the book in its title, The Liberty Paradox, was to say that liberty has always been these two elements of freedom and responsibility. So I'm glad that somebody like you would see within it an implication of other writers' views on this balance, this dichotomy between freedom and responsibility. And I'm very glad to take that, even though I had not really thought of it at the time. But I'm pleased that you should raise it.
Yeah, so after reading like some excerpts from the book, what I found is it is not only about a professional aspect of human rights, it's also about personal experiences drawn even from a decade of visiting Nepal for the Himalayan Field School, right? So I think somewhere, maybe unknowingly or in your subconscious mind, like these things would have framed your personal experiences in visiting country like Nepal, in Himalayan Field School, would have framed certain ideas that are there, isn't it? Yeah.
Absolutely. A really insightful point. And indeed, as you will have seen in the book, I do draw on lots of experiences overseas. And, I now live in a country that is not my original country. And I've done work in lots of countries, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. And many of them are developing countries. So I have, I hope, learnt lessons from those experiences. With respect to Nepal, yes, in particular, because I've been coming here regularly for more than a decade. Ben Saul and I started coming here on an AusAid project in 2009. So there's no doubt that a subliminal, but also I think quite explicit set of lessons have been learnt by integrating with Nepal and Nepalese culture and Nepalese so closely. The fact that our association between Sydney Law School and Kathmandu School of Law is so close and intimate now. I mean, you're like friends and colleagues. And the fact that the students, we get to see them here regularly, all of them, but also a batch of 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 who join the Himalayan Field School, and you really get to know them as well as you get to know your own my own students from Sydney. And I learn from them. I mean, the batch that we have at the moment are all first years. So very young, the youngest lawyers, the youngest students at a university. And yet I learn from them. They teach me, even if they don't know it, they teach me. So there's no doubt that my thoughts on what freedom and responsibility mean have been coloured not only by my experiences in the West, but also seeing what that means for people in a developing country such as Nepal, and over a period of, as you say, 13, 14 years. And that, it sounds trite, and people say this all the time, but it's not only a privilege, of course it is, but it's also a challenge, and it's inspiring. It makes you realise, and I think many of the Sydney students say that, not only how lucky they are, but also, frankly, how, in a way, deficient they are in terms of their capacity to deal with the trials and tribulations of life, because the trials and tribulations of life for many people in Nepal are of a different order than the trials and tribulations of us in the West. And that is an education for me, and I think for my students, and so that must have an effect on the way I think professionally and personally. And I'm sure, well, it is. There are stories there of Nepal in there, of the brick kilns, of the traffic in Nepal, of the Nepali people, and the question of dignity. What I and my students find all the time when we are here in Nepal, anywhere in the Malamshi Valley or here in Kathmandu, is that sort of sense of pride and self-awareness and dignity that the Nepalis have, no matter what their circumstances, no matter how impoverished and different they are from ours. I think that's quite remarkable, and I think it's a terrific lesson and experience for our students and for me to encounter.
Yeah. So you were telling me about the new book that you're writing. Can you give us maybe an idea about what that book will be about?
Do you know, that has an HFS history as well, because the book is not at all about Nepal or the Himalayan Field School, but the last time I was, 2 or 3 times ago when I was here on HFS, 2020, I was flying home after HFS, and I watched a movie called Official Secrets with Keira Knightley in it, which is a very legal-oriented movie about somebody in Britain whistleblowing on the Americans and their desire for obtaining information about Iraq that it would sufficiently justify them invading Iraq. Anyhow, she releases this information, and it's all about how she faces a prosecution in the United Kingdom. And there's a lawyer, young, experienced, but still relatively young, no money, no prospects that this is going to win, but takes it on. And he eventually does effectively win. He certainly allows this whistleblower to achieve a satisfactory end rather than being put in jail. And I thought, that would be wonderful. Who do I know that I could write a book about like that? And as I was dwelling in this, I realized that one of my great friends, who is in fact a English Indian African, who lives and works and was born in the United Kingdom, ran a case 25 years ago against a big British asbestos mining company, which was mining asbestos in South Africa for 90 years, right up until the early 70s. And for a large hunk of that time, 60s and 70s, a good 15, 20 years, they were doing so knowing that what their product did to the human body was cancerous and deadly. And they hid this information, they quelled it, they suppressed it, they interfered with scientists who were trying to observe these diseases that the miners and people who lived around the mines and mills were suffering. So he brought on this case representing 7,500 people against the British company in the British courts. And this raised huge, almost insurmountable, and he was told they were insurmountable questions of law, whether it was the right forum to run this case in the United Kingdom. Surely it should be South Africa, many people claimed, where the event occurred. And whether it was a corporate veil question. Was the corporation in South Africa a separate entity from the corporation in the United Kingdom, even though it was a subsidiary of the parent? Anyhow, those big legal questions are in the book. And they're there. Of course, it's an important part of the way the 9 years of litigation proceeded. But in fact, the real essence of the book is telling the story of how Richard, a young lawyer, relatively young lawyer, with absolutely no money in his law firm, they were in rented accommodation, all their chairs and tables were mismatched, how he took on this case. And after 9 years, he obtained a settlement. So he didn't win he didn't win the ultimate decision in the courts, but he did win a decision by the House of Lords to say this could be run in the British courts. At which point, the British company, Cape, said, "Okay, we'll settle." It took 3 years to settle, but he still settled. And so he obtained some recompense, a financial recompense for these 7,500 almost all black and coloured Africans. Meanwhile, during the 9 years, more than 700 of them had died because of their afflictions due to asbestos. So it's an amazing story in terms of David versus Goliath, but it's also an amazing story in the way Richard Mirren remembers all the strange and vaudevillian and rather crazy things that happened along the way, the people he met, the things that he did. And he has got an extraordinary memory. And so I interviewed him for nearly 200 hours, drew all this material together. I went to South Africa and interviewed people there, the medics, politicians, some of the survivors, some of the victims' families, in these little villages where the mining and milling took place. And it created a magnificent, to me, magnificent tapestry of a human story behind the legal headlines. And that really is what the book is about, that sort of triumph of the human spirit in law, as well as these people in South Africa never believing they could win against a corporation in the United Kingdom. But they did. And all of this happened all the mining happened during the apartheid years, so it had a very strong racial dimension to it, which Richard chimed into as well, because he was an Indian African, albeit born in Britain. So he suffered from racism as well during his own childhood. Gave him that drive to take on the case. But the case was then argued post apartheid in the 90s, late 90s. So it was like a coming of age in a way for the new South Africa. It ran from 1995 to 2004. And it was great fun to write.
So when will that be published?
It is published in May this year.
This year.
Yeah, it's called In a Rain of Dust.
Okay. The name is Rain of Dust.
In a Rain of Dust.
Okay.
And the reason it's called that is because it itself is an interesting story, because the term came from a medical officer of the Cape Asbestos Company himself, who was observing one of the mills in which the raw asbestos was brought to be packed into containers. It was packed, it was compacted by virtue of young children stamping it down.
Okay.
And they were in a big vat, and raw asbestos was poured in over their heads, and then they would trample it until it was compacted. And they were in a rain of dust, he said, of asbestos dust, which we now know is lethal in small quantities. And these children had it poured in over their heads for hours. The image is almost beyond belief, horrifying. So it seems odd, this term, in a rain of dust, but in the book, I hope, when people read it, they realize just what that means, and they can visualize the horror of that.
Yeah, we are eagerly waiting for that book now.
So am I.
So is it connected to your ideas that you have framed in previous books, like be it the book on International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or the book on finance and human rights? Is it like
is it a progression?
Yeah.
I suppose so, yes. In themes, in the themes, yes. But going back to your first couple of questions, it is much more of a story. I mean, this one is just a story from the beginning to the end. How did this all happen? So it is one big story. But of course, it is about economic, social and cultural and civil and political rights, the whole panoply of rights of these people and how they are suffering, and the fact that nearly all of them were illiterate. Many of them had to sign their consent forms to become plaintiffs by a thumbprint. And yet they still, by virtue of a lawyer, were able to achieve what they saw as a human rights outcome, a beneficial human rights outcome. It was against a corporation, which does chime with my work over the last 25 years on business and human rights. It was transnational, which is obviously a part of my international law focus. Financial, yes, in the sense that obviously banks were involved in the settlement of this case, for instance. It wasn't specifically looking at finance, so it was more looking at how the financiers funding a corporation such as Cape to undertake its operations. But there was a financial backdrop. And in fact, really the Necessary Evil book on finance is all about the fact that behind all business and all international trade, finance is always the deep and sometimes very dark shadow. So no matter what you're talking about in terms of trade, development, aid, or commerce, finance is always at the back. And that book was trying to understand just how that background, powerful sector should be made more accountable for the things that happen in the more open, bright light of day through the corporations that they fund. So yes, it's in the background there. So they're all connected.
Yeah. So a final question, or I would ask you, what message will you give for young scholars in Nepal, and what are the gaps that are left in the literature with regard to human rights specific in Nepal, which we as young scholars can contribute, or our students can contribute to?
be bold. You are the future of this country. Lawyers, whether we like it or not, tend to be leaders in commerce, in politics, and in many other fields. They are trained to be analytical. They are trained to understand how the legal order works. And the legal order is often the thing that is both driven by the social order and drives the social order. So lawyers often are criticised, and I often criticise them as well, are nevertheless absolutely critical to the future of any country, including a developing country. So be bold, be confident in the fact that you are going to be, whether you know it or not, you are going to be future leaders of this country or elsewhere. In terms of the things to look out for the unusual, the unexpected, the awkward, the unusual bedfellows. And I suppose that's what I've tried to do at the very beginning. Business and human rights 30 years ago seemed an anomaly. What does that mean? Surely it's human rights and international law. Finance and human rights, even more of an anomaly. Yeah. People didn't think that really existed. And yet, thinking about how, say, for instance, tax reform in any country, but particularly a developing country like Nepal, how tax reform is a human rights issue may seem counterintuitive or even slightly unappealing to your students. But I would suggest that's exactly where human rights people, as well as accountants and economists, should be focusing. Because without a tax base, without a tax revenue, the government isn't able to function properly or efficiently. It can't provide all the needs that are necessary for a welfare state for many people who are on the margins. It can't keep the roads safe. It can't build public hospitals, public education, all of those things. So things like tax that may not seem like a human rights issue are in fact incredibly important. So broadly, I would say, from my own experiences, and there are other intersections, but for me, economics is critical. The political economy and human rights are intersected inevitably and inextricably. And though often we don't teach that sort of thing in law school, I think we need to, and I think our students must pick it up and draw on it. And this HFS is a perfect example of that. This whole program is riven with human rights, the economy, and politics. And I think that's what all students, whether they're Sydney or KSL, need to bear in mind.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor David, for this wonderful interaction.
My pleasure.
We are eagerly waiting for your new book.
Really, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.